Hi, everybody, and welcome to ShotSpotter 101. My name is Kaitlyn, and I'm part of the Defund LMPD Spying collective. So ShotSpotter is something that we've been hearing a lot about nationally in connection to police reforms and violence prevention. And we've also been hearing about it a lot locally here in Louisville. So as a collective, we are especially interested in defunding this technology and divesting from its use. And part of that effort involves actually learning about ShotSpotter. So today I'm joined by Dr. Justin Turner, who's a criminology and criminal justice professor with research expertise in policing. He's also, luckily, part of the Defund LMPD Spying collective. So welcome, Justin. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. So our goal today is to walk away with a general understanding of what ShotSpotter is and some of the arguments around it, some of the issues with it, especially as those issues relate to Louisville. So Justin, can you start off giving us a little overview of the basics of ShotSpotter?
Yeah, excited to be here, excited to talk about this type of technology. So I guess the best, I don't know, for me, the best way to kind of think through what ShotSpotter is to compare to the things that we all probably know and maybe love, and if we're not too privacy concerned, right? And I think ShotSpotter, the best way to think about ShotSpotter is it's kind of like Amazon's Alexa services, right? Those Echo Shows, the Echo Dots, right? Basically, it's these microphones that are always kind of listening, and what they're listening for, or at least what they advertise they're listening for, is gunfire, right? Gunshots, right? So when it hears these gunshots, much like when we say, Alexa, turn on the lights, right? ShotSpotter is activated, right? So it records these kind of brief moments, anywhere between 1 and 5 seconds before, and then 1 and 5 seconds after the gunshot, and ultimately kind of creates this location pinpoint on a map, right, for the police to go to that's within a block, within a neighborhood, within a couple of feet of where that gunshot was detected, right, depending on the microphone. So the more microphones, the more accurate it is, right? Same thing with Alexa, right? You have the more Alexa in the house, the easier it is to turn your lights on anywhere in the house, right? So basically what it is then, what ShotSpotter sells itself as, right, is acoustic technology that is billed as a real-time gunshot detection and alert system, right? Their words here. And again, it does this by kind of using these microphones. They used to look like medium-sized pizzas, so about this big. Now they also have microphones as well, and they go up on light poles. They're on top of certain buildings, right? And again, they catch noise and ultimately direct the police to respond to those areas, to those locations, right? Like pinpoints on a map, right? But at the same time, right, it's focused on not gunshots as it's a ShotSpotter, right, but it focuses on noise that reaches a certain decimal. So oftentimes it picks up car backfire, loud noises perhaps, or even just fireworks, right, these kind of common things, right? So not just does it have microphones and have this kind of map program for police officers, but it also has this kind of algorithmic technology that it sells itself as, it bills itself as, that can separate these shots so that the police are arriving to gunshots and not fireworks. So it has this algorithm that weeds through all of this data that can pinpoint whether or not these are gunshots, it says, right? And then sends it to a real-time person who confirms it is a gunshot, and then it sends it to either the 911, the police's handheld phone, or the computer database for the police, right? Pinpointing within a couple feet to a block of where that gunfire was recorded. And so that's basically it, right? It records these noises above a certain decimal and notifies the police, and the police ideally show up in response to this technology.
So what does this look like in Louisville? Just kind of in general, like, do we have it? I know we have it, but where does this kind of look like in terms of spacing?
Yeah, absolutely. We do have it. Hence the reason why we have a collective that is looking to defund it. But I think that's a great question. Back to the 101 though. So yes, we have it, but like most other police agencies across the country, and I want to be clear here, Louisville's not unique in using ShotSpotter. It's not unique in its strategies. It's not unique in its results, right? This is a fairly consistent findings for ShotSpotter so far. But what we see is that generally the police make an argument that it's not really in the public's best interest to know where this ShotSpotter these locations are. So what we do know, we've gone through kind of public access requests, right? And this pretty much it shows us where the police are responding to these shots at. And what we see is that ShotSpotter generally finds itself placed in light poles and rooftops of the Russell and Shawnee neighborhoods specifically. They're also located in portions of Portland, Chickasaw, and Smoketown, as well as Old Louisville, right, that are all kind of covered in some way. So if we think about it, ShotSpotter kind of creates a circle, right, of what it can pick up on, right? So not all of Smoketown's captured, but some parts of it fall within that circle of those microphones, right? So that's where it exists in Louisville. So it's throughout that place, and ideally, at least the police want to expand on this. So, yeah.
So ideally, what are some of the arguments that have been made for ShotSpotter? What are some of the justifications that are used to, get the money and the resources and the backing to have this type of technology?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So what I'm going to kind of convey here are the narratives they use, that ShotSpotter uses to sell to police, that perhaps the police use to sell to their city councils to increase their budgets, or to put that as a byline in their budget, right? So I want to use those as what I'm going to talk about here, right? But all of that starts with one reality that I do think is important, and that is what we have to acknowledge. And we have to acknowledge here that gun violence is a very real problem. Violence in general is a problem, right? Nobody wants to be victimized, particularly by a violent crime. Nobody does. It's a weird thing we all have, I guess. And this isn't just in Louisville, right? Nobody wants to be victimized across the country. So what ShotSpotter does is it plays upon that narrative, right? Our fears of violent crime, whether they're real or justified, right? And sells itself as this kind of eye in the sky technology, right? It uses algorithms, right? You can look at your phone for these maps, right? It has this acoustic technology, right? That makes it seem unbiased, makes it seem like it's going to be a solution, right? And if you think about what's going on in policing, there's a lot of, and in general, across all these types of different places, right? Technology is oftentimes a selling point, right? And ShotSpotter is no different, right? So it does all this by selling itself as this eye in the sky. And while concerns over violent crime is the kind of major public narrative that ShotSpotter exists within, right? We can't look past other issues the police themselves have stated on why they want this technology and what this technology can do for them. So one of those is the fact that there are neighborhoods that simply don't like talking to the police, right? And I use neighborhoods here. We know individuals, some do and some don't, and that's all valid. But what the police argue in a lot of different circumstances are that these communities, those communities that have high levels of violence, are also the ones who don't want to talk to the police, don't want to welcome the police in, right? Shifting that blame on the community for they should be responsible for how the police treat them rather than the other way around, right? This common narrative that we see. Right. So the police see the ShotSpotter technology as basically a means of getting around community snitching, right, so to speak, right? In other words, ShotSpotter here can help the police when the community doesn't want to help. And as ShotSpotter has said, it ultimately wants to be the ears on the street for the police. So all these narratives kind of fit together. And With these narratives, we get these kind of goals too. And I know I'm kind of going long, but there's a bunch of stuff kind of going on here, right? So we have these narratives, right? It's the eye in the sky, right? People are afraid of crime. This can solve it because it's a technology. And there's an algorithm that we can use, right? The police see it as an ability to get into the community, right? To combat people's unwillingness to talk to the police, right? So on the surface, then these goals are pretty simple, right? Like many of these technologies, ShotSpotter wants to act as a deterrent, right? And again, the most successful way it can be a deterrent is if it can be used to make arrest without the need for a victim, which is the problem with gunfire, right? Gunshot victims, right? We know they got shot by a gun. We have evidence here. It's a victim. We're talking to them. They have a gunshot wound, right? We know these things, but the gunfire aspect is the problem because there is no victim here. So it has this kind of preventative logic that could hopefully work out to help deter people from violence because ShotSpotter increases the likelihood of getting caught. And if it can't deter, then, right, it wants to shave off those important seconds that differentiates ShotSpotter from somebody calling 911, right? So they want to respond to the scene, so they maybe have a higher chance to catch a bad guy. And if there is no bad guy, they want to be able to sell themselves as being able to show up fast enough to save a victim's life. Importantly, generally speaking, ShotSpotter is not calling 911 and calling emergency services to help a victim out. So the purpose here is to prevent that gunshot. But again, that ear on the sky thing is that other type of goal. It provides access. We see this in the narratives for justification most profusely here. Police ultimately want legibility, right? It's what helps them police, right? What happens when the police can't see a crime take place? Well, there's not much they can do, right? Particularly when the community doesn't trust them. So ShotSpotter not only offers this ability to monitor community without their kind of desire to be monitored, but it offers this solution, right? That not just we have deterrence here, we have access. It fills in the gaps when the officers can't see into the community. So the goal here, of course, of the police is that this will allow for what they say is better policing. They can now use ShotSpotter to help cover areas that were once closed off to them unless a crime took place and was reported. Right now, we have this kind of bird's eye view technology that allows the police to constantly monitor the neighborhoods that have ShotSpotter in them, basically.
So, I mean, that's all, in theory. And that's, and those are just the stated goals.
Those are just, to be clear, those are the stated goals by the police. That's what the police argue for when they go up in front of city council. That's what ShotSpotter argues when they're trying to peddle their wares to the police themselves, right? At these conferences that police go to find the next latest technology, right? These are their things from their websites, from their words. Importantly, just to be clear, but yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So if we think about that and then we kind of critique it and think about some of the problems with ShotSpotter, I mean, I can imagine even just in what you talked about, in terms of like where ShotSpotter is across Louisville Metro, how are cities or different spaces in different cities experiencing this technology? I would venture to assume that it's not experienced the same way in one city. But how are we seeing that in terms of critiquing it, like as a problem with ShotSpotter in terms of how it's actually being applied?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And just to kind of be clear, ShotSpotter is a relatively new technology. For instance, Louisville got in 2017. It's been around in some form or fashion since 2003. But not really heavily used until 2015-16. So I say all that to say that we have a lot of good information on this, and we're still collecting more. But most of that information coming from most of the cities around the United States who have this, places like Kansas City, Chicago, right, DC, right, the places who have had it, right, San Diego, Atlanta, right? We're getting consistent reports about what is happening here, right? And so I want to make that clear. I want to focus on Louisville here, but It seems to be a general consensus across our research and across the experiences of communities that experience ShotSpotter, right, that these findings all kind of exist together, right? So in saying all that, I want to kind of turn to Louisville and just kind of spout some numbers that can kind of help us clarify the scope of what ShotSpotter does, right? So, excuse me, after requesting public access, we've seen that we have some information that ranges from February of 2020 to February of 2022 in Louisville, right? So a 2-year period, we saw over 14,000 ShotSpotter alerts, right, that were reported to LMPD, right? They were reported from the neighborhoods of Russell, Portland, California, Shawnee, and Beachmont, to name a few of those places that was reported on. And out of those 14,000, right, remember they have that AI technology, they have real-time people, so they're analyzing to determine if these are gunshots. So these are just alerts, right? So out of those 14,000 alerts, there were about 8,900 or so alerts that were answered by the LMPD, meaning that the LMPD thought this was a gunfire, so they sent somebody out. This in turn resulted in the LMPD, so Louisville police here, Louisville Metro, basically showing up to these neighborhoods, the Russells, the Portlands, the Shawnees, and Beachmonts, right, for roughly a total of 2,700 hours, I think is the number, 2,700, yeah, about 114 days. They showed up to these communities that amount of time. Well, we can drill down even further here. So out of that 8,900 alerts that the police actually showed up or answered to, about 4,400, so about half of those deployments lasted for less than 10 minutes, which indicates a couple of things. Presumably, it indicates that there was no further investigation that was warranted. So there's no victim. They didn't find any evidence of a gunshot outside of ShotSpotter, right? And nobody was talking to them, right? So that's generally, and they stay there for 10 minutes. On policy, LMPD has a policy where they're supposed to investigate the community. So going around knocking on doors, asking if people know anything. Oftentimes the community says they don't get asked these types of questions, and perhaps maybe don't want to be asked these questions or don't have the police knocking on their doors at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But regardless, they're not getting any of this information. So they're only staying there for about 10 minutes. So despite the short-lived nature of almost half of these calls then, these deployments, right, these alerts brought LMPD into these neighborhoods and communities for, again, 114 days over a 2-year period, right? And this is ShotSpotter alone. And again, this is pretty consistent in any city you see with ShotSpotter. So from Atlanta, who used to use it, had a fairly consistent kind of rating. Kansas City and even Chicago all kind of resemble these as well. We've seen that even in recent investigations, outlets like Motherboard, which is this kind of offshoot of Vice News that focuses specifically on technology. They do really good stuff. They do a lot of work on racial profiling, from facial recognition technology to this type of kind of investigative reporting. And in this, they found that where ShotSpotter occurs is also unequal, meaning then in places like Chicago, right, where Motherboard found that most of the white neighborhoods had no sensors. And this is fairly consistent with Atlanta. This was consistent with Kansas City, and this is consistent with Louisville. So what we see here is we have all this technological solutions, all these kind of, all this technology will save us. And basically what we have here is a common problem we see in things like hotspot policing, which is something that we developed. Some argue in the 1990s, others argue in the 1900s. Basically, the history of police has been about hotspot policing. So on paper here, all of this sounds like a common sense idea. You use these gunfire technologies, right? Send the police to where there is more crime, right? That all makes sense in some ways, right? But we know what this really means, right? It means increased police presence. It means increased likelihood of being stopped and targeted by the police for doing those kind of normal everyday things, like driving to work, driving back from work, right? Walking to the corner store, having a barbecue with friends out in a public space. This is what we see out of ShotSpotter. It increases contact, right? Much like hotspot policing. So these technologies, right, have been found not only to be less effective on reducing gunfire, but more effective on increasing police contact more completely.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of punctuate a point that you made, that 114 days, because that 114 days is total, right? A full 100, like when we added up together all of the time, you know, it's not that they went to these neighborhoods 114 days out of 2 years. It's that if you added up all the time from these alerts across 2 years, LMPD occupied these neighborhoods. It's almost as if they were sitting there for 114 days straight, right? Like you can imagine that. Yeah.
About 2,700 hours, right? Which works out to about 114 days out of 2 years, right?
Yeah.
So they're that total of that many hours, which equates to, we just did the math for you to help, but yeah, good point.
Yeah. Yeah. So 114 days, you know, of kind of occupying these spaces and this kind of contact of being in contact with people in the neighborhood. So can you elaborate on this contact piece? Like, what does that look like? And what are kind of the repercussions of that?
Yeah, we don't, unfortunately, much like any example of police violence or contact, we don't have to look far for examples. And we can take Chicago's recent issues, right? And specifically the tragic death and murder of Adam Toledo, the 13-year-old kid who, simply put, right, was out of his place. The police got a ShotSpotter response. They responded in, I think, under 5 minutes or so. But they got to the scene of where ShotSpotter put them. Again, it puts you in a kind of a block, right? It's not going to have you in the exact space where this gunfire was. It'll have you on that street within that block kind of thing. So it's fairly specific, but, you know, just like our GPS on our phones, it's not exact. But regardless, Adam Toledo, the cops pulled up. Adam Toledo was in that spot. The cops got out. Adam Toledo fled. The cops arriving to the scene are arriving to a possible gunfire. So they're arriving to the scene thinking that the person they're looking for has a gun and is a threat. They see Toledo, they get out of their car and chase down Toledo and shoot him. We saw the body camera footage from there, right? And yet we have yet to see a kind of gun materialize. At least it hasn't been presented by the Chicago PD yet, right? So that's what I mean by contact. And we see this even from the police's own reports, right? ShotSpotter, it was revealed last year that the technology in Chicago was only responsible for 10% for 10% of the gun-related arrest, right? But again, even if the police arrive on the scene, they don't often know what they're looking for, as in the case with Toledo. So anyone around this scene and wherever this pinpoint on the map was, right, sent by ShotSpotter becomes a suspect, right? Again, unarmed Adam Toledo was one of those suspects who happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, and the police killed him for it. But still, what we see is this contact, it's summoned, right, by ShotSpotter, right? The police are summoned to these communities. And what we see with ShotSpotter, particularly Black and brown communities who have previous histories with what police contact really means, right? And they're arriving to these scenes thinking that there is an armed threat, right? So what this is actually doing then is providing justification for police presence in communities. And the ACLU has a really interesting report too, that we're seeing ShotSpotter being used to help justify police behavior or help use to prosecute people in the courtroom. So it's becoming evidence in certain ways, right? Deontay Rawlings is a good example. Deontay Rawlings was a young teenager in Washington, D.C. In 2007. Two off-duty police officers not in uniform noticed that Rawlings was driving around in a motorbike that was reported stolen. At least they assumed it was reported stolen, looked like one that was stolen. And they chased Rawlings, who then fled down the street into an alley. One of the officers said that they heard a gunshot and thought they were getting fired at by Rawlings, so they returned fire and killed teenage Rawlings, much in similar ways that Adam Toledo, right? So claimed that he was shot at by Rawlings. No gun was found. Again, the officers were off duty and not in uniform. So what we see here then is that the police behavior became justified in the court of law because ShotSpotter reported that there was a notification of a shot fired. This was in 2007 at that time, right? It wasn't inherently clear whether this was a gunshot or a backfire, right? But it became evidence enough to justify the police felt that they were being attacked and shot at, and thus they were justified in returning fire again, even though no gun has been found. So basically then what this is actually doing is not really preventing gunfire impacting gun violence, but rather just acting as a confirmation for the police that they are arriving to a dangerous scene and that everyone around them will be a threat. So rather than community-oriented policing, ShotSpotter basically shapes the police into or confirms at least it's this form of an occupying force for communities who have a very long history of little crime prevention, but a lot of police violence.
So with all of that said, what about the effectiveness of this technology, especially here? Is it effective? I mean, it keeps talking about crime prevention and detection and all that. So how can we understand the effectiveness or the ineffectiveness of ShotSpotter here?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And again, places like Chicago continuously remind us that ShotSpotter is only responsible for 10% of gun-related arrests. And while that might be justification for some, as we'll talk about, I don't think cost-wise it's effective. And I think that 10% is perhaps hiding other figures of contact that are inherently problematic. But with all that said, we can ask this general question. And in Louisville, again, just to remind you, about half of the alerts triggered in Louisville were incredibly short-lived and warranted no further investigation. This could be because of a false alert, or it could be no danger was detected, nobody wants to talk, etc. And according to the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting, the officers typically clear the scenes within minutes. They seldom find evidence of a shooting, and the calls rarely lead to an arrest, right? So now something that I think is important to note is that some of the pushback against this kind of ineffectiveness, right, via lack of arrest, has basically come from the fact that up until about a month ago, officers really couldn't arrest people for random gunfire. Right. And if you're paying attention, Louisville just passed a new ordinance that made it a misdemeanor, a Class A misdemeanor, punishable up to 1 year of jail time for firing a weapon. Right. And I don't want to kind of delve into conspiratorial kind of issues in general, but we see that the main problem with ShotSpotter is oftentimes there is no victim. Right. It's creating access. Right. Well, we also know that oftentimes when we create laws that look good on they look good in black and white. Oftentimes it remains colorblind, right? This law offers that opportunity because it gets rid of the victim, right? We see that in 2022, while the effectiveness of ShotSpotter had yet to be proven by the LMPD, the program did receive an expansion alongside these new laws outlawing random gunfire in the city. And this is something that the new police chief, Erica Shields, who left Atlanta after they got rid of ShotSpotter because of its ineffectiveness, says, quote, "Right now, the way the state law is, our cases are not taken forward unless we have a victim. So if we're getting ShotSpotter hits that we have gunfire in an area, we go out, someone's shooting a gun, there's not a victim, that's not chargeable. But in this new law, right, Shields implies that that's going to change things. So that's an important thing to kind of just look out for without being conspiratorial, unless we don't want to trust perhaps the track record of LMPD reforms over the last 70 years.
Well, I think it's interesting that one of the biggest critiques of ShotSpotter has been, hey, there are very few arrests that are actually resulting from these. And then, again, not conspiratorially, but well, now, we have this ordinance that says that we can make arrests based on random gunfire. And so now, like one of the main arguments against ShotSpotter that it doesn't lead to arrest, or it can't, because it can't lead to arrest due to the lack of this ordinance, is now going to go away. And so now this technology can be bolstered, and we're probably going to see arrests increase based on ShotSpotter alerts, because ShotSpotter is going to alert, police are going to go there, they're going to find there's no victim, but there is somebody shooting their gun off randomly, and now they've made an arrest. So now, supposedly, right, the effectiveness of ShotSpotter is going to increase because now we're going to see those arrests increase, but it's actually just conflating just like buoying this in a way that is kind of false, because we've just changed an ordinance. It's not that the technology has actually gotten better at detecting or better at deterring or anything like that.
Yeah, and again, think about where these shot spotters are being placed, and think about how those are going to be enforced, right? Mm-hmm. And that's inherently going to be, so this ordinance is going to be enforced, so the cop can be there and they can see them. Maybe somebody can call in, but cops aren't showing up for a misdemeanor gunfire, right? In that case, if somebody calls it in, right? But yeah, think about, right, where these are placed in these contexts, the lack of effectiveness. We're going to rig the numbers in certain ways, and hope that does something to violence, as long as we can avoid doing anything for the communities who are experiencing these high levels of violence, right? But, maybe this isn't the best thing to say, but maybe ShotSpotter can change these things, right? But track record clearly shows no. The history of these types of things have basically been proven to be fairly ineffective, as well as racist in implementation. Sorry. And this seems no different right now, right? But
so in terms of kind of another major point of critique, what's the bottom line? What is the cost of ShotSpotter here?
Yeah, it's I think so there's two ways to look at that, I think, to answer this question. I think oftentimes there's a poor kind of way to explain this. The one is, we have to understand that there are two different numbers. The number here is the same number, but used in two different ways, right? So you have the police budget, which is its own pie, right? And you have what it devotes its money to: pensions, overtime, technology, equipment, rubber bullets, stuff like that. And so it has a line in the budget. And that's one number, right? So how much does it take up in this budget, right? And they have to use that to kind of the police have to use that to justify their budgets to the city council. But we also have that other number too, because we see that any expansion in police budgets doesn't inherently come from the fact that we have more money for the city. It means that we readjust and reallocate the pie that is the city budget in a way that allows the police to gain more of that pie, right? So ShotSpotter fits into both of those spaces, right? So when I start talking about the costs, right, that's an important kind of thing to recognize. And we saw in 2017, its first year in Louisville, the costs were estimated to be about $390,000. So that's microphones, that's the app access and technology, and that's the data storage stuff, right? The training goes along with that and everything like that, right? And they come in 3-mile radiuses is how ShotSpotter operates. So each 3-mile expansion is another $3,900 or $3,900,000, right? And if we want to add in inflation, which I think they say it's like 7%, right? So we can probably assume a little bit more money is going into this. And we just saw with the 2021 to 2022 Metro budget, so last year's budget, right? The funding for ShotSpotter had been increased from $800,000, right? So it expanded from 2017 to 2019. And then 2021, it expanded from that $800,000 in the police budget to $1.6 million going to the police, specifically earmarked for ShotSpotter. right, to expand into specifically California Park Hill and then quote unquote other neighborhoods. So we see here these expansions occur generally in 3-mile radiuses, according to ShotSpotter. So each time one of these happen, right, we see that kind of $400,000 bump or around there, depending on how the costs are changing. Perhaps they figure out a better way to save storage, right? So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is that 1.6 is also coming from the city budget itself, right? So not just the police budget, but the city budget, who accommodates, right, as talking to any city council member in these conversations, right, acknowledge, right, they have to accommodate for ShotSpotter, right? It means they have to put it into that budget, meaning then it's still coming from the larger pie that is the city government budget, which is that second kind of point, right? So 1.6 million coming from there as we cut libraries and library services or create restrictions on other types of services. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I'll also say too, I know that's something that we're going to be talking about later, probably just in graphic form, is kind of how the ARP, like how the police budget, some of the American Rescue Plan money is being shifted into policing, and hopefully we'll specifically be able to know how much ShotSpotter is getting out of that fund as well, because that's, you know, money that is being used in some ways to support spaces for houseless people and for other types of like violence prevention. So we'll be able to see kind of how that breaks down specifically for this technology as well. So if ShotSpotter is being plugged as crime prevention, but it's not doing that, and you alluded to this a little bit, but what could we be doing instead, right? If people want to feel safe, which I agree, I think, you know, we can all agree we want to feel safe. What else could we be doing instead of ShotSpotter? Yeah,
so there are a number of different options. We know in a lot of ways what does work to reduce crime, and while a lot of people don't like hearing this, right, we know that police generally don't reduce crime, right, at least consistently, for a lot of different reasons, right? So putting this money into things that we do know reduces crime, right? Home voucher programs in Philadelphia over the last couple of years, the expansion of those programs, right, where people who meet certain criteria around income can get local city grants to repair their home, build put a new roof on, as big as putting a new roof on or putting a furnace in or a AC unit in or whatever you want to do, right, to putting in and redoing your lawn work or putting up a fence and fixing the fence, right? So those home voucher programs have been rather successful. So Louisville has a little bit of that, but expanding that in specific ways, advertising and creating that as a crutch for community, a way for communities to reduce violence, I think would be interesting and effective. We also see a number of other places, right, community organizations focused on reducing violence, not organizations that are community driven, but organizations within the community, communities themselves focused on reducing violence, and creating organizations around that have been shown to be effective. Creating youth programs, something for youth to do, right, other than go to Kentucky Kingdom, you know, creating job programs. And we have some of that here, but again, if we want to reduce crime, right, and that's hopefully everybody's goal, we want to increase safety, right, we have to acknowledge that these work, and we have to fund these in ways that can reduce crime, much like we assume funding police and providing police more money could reduce crime, right? We know it doesn't, but we assume it does. Why don't we treat other programs like that? But more specifically, I think the argument still has to remain within the communities, right? Within California Hills neighborhood, right? Or California Park Hill, right? Those areas, right? These people living there, right? We should work towards creating the spaces where they're protected from certain things, and where they can kind of create the autonomy for their own safety and protection. And we know those are the most effective ways to reduce crime. That sounds very abstract, but it's basically, what does the community need? What are the best alternatives to these types of solutions that revolve around violence that we can implement? And the communities who are involved in this are going to help with that and should have a place in the same. So, but that's all I'll say on that. We can talk about that more in 103. If there's a 103, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I definitely think we will have plenty to talk about in terms of, kind of visioning alternatives and, divesting from this apparatus, because I think it's been kind of shown across the board that it's not working. Not just ShotSpotter in the small scale, but the whole policing institution. So I think those are all the things that we really wanted to cover, unless there's anything else that you wanted to add in terms of this topic.
No, no.
Okay. All right. So for those of you watching, if you want to stay up to date on the things we're doing, you can go to our Facebook page. It's Defund LMPD Spying. So we'll be sharing info, educational resources, any events that we're putting on, and looking for your input as well. So one of the next events that we're going to have on May 22nd, we'll be going on a spy hunt. So as Justin mentioned, we don't have the exact locations of the ShotSpotter devices because it's supposedly a public safety hazard. So we have the blocks. We have the blocks that they're located at. And so we'll kind of be going out looking for these ShotSpotter devices, trying to figure out where they are and where they're situated. So we're going to be doing that on May 22nd. And then, just stay up to date on our Facebook page, and we'll post any other events, our analyses of the kind of the budget and any of our alert data and any other related resources. So thanks so much for attending ShotSpotter 101.
Thanks, everybody.